June 8, 1967. The perfect storm. The morning sun rose over the eastern Mediterranean in a haze of salt spray and tension. It was the fourth day of the six-day war, and Israel's military forces were running on caffeine, instinct, and dwindling reserves of adrenaline. At precisely 8 a.m. local time, Israeli reconnaissance aircraft reported significant naval activity near El Arish, a small but strategic port on the Sinai coast. On the Israeli Defense Forces radar, this raised immediate red flags. Egyptian forces, though battered, were still in motion. Radio intercepts picked up cryptic messages from Egyptian channels, hints of Soviet involvement, whispers of ships coming to evacuate key personnel. The specter of direct Russian interference loomed heavily, a nightmare scenario no Israeli commander wanted to face. At the same time, cutting silently through international waters north of the Sinai Peninsula, the USS Liberty, hull number AGTR-5, moved at a slow, deliberate pace. She wasn't a combat ship, but a signals intelligence vessel, a former World War II Liberty-class freighter that had been transformed into a floating antenna farm. Her decks bristled with strange-looking masts, radar domes, and satellite dishes. Inside, teams of cryptologists, linguists, and intelligence officers pored over intercepted Arabic, Hebrew, and Russian transmissions. The Liberty's role was quiet and invisible, to listen, not to fight. But visibility that day was anything but clear. A low mist clung to the water's surface, and the ship's American flag hung limp on the mast, its stars and stripes hidden in the still air. There was no wind to lift it. From a distance, and especially from the air, the vessel could have looked like many things. Not clearly American, not clearly civilian, just another gray hull in a gray sea. On the Israeli side, nerves were fraying. Every commander, every pilot, every radar operator was stretched to the limit. The night before, rumors had rippled through the command structure. A Soviet fleet might be moving into the theater. The stakes of the war could escalate beyond anyone's control. In such a volatile scenario, misidentifications could become lethal mistakes. Captain Isaac Ben Hanan, then a young but battle-tested commander of an Israeli Navy torpedo boat squadron, would later remember the tension in those hours. His squadron had been briefed with urgency. Expect Russian-built vessels, possibly under Egyptian command. Be prepared for enemy commando landings. Act fast. He later told interviewers, "We were told to expect Russian ships trying to rescue Egyptian commandos. Every shadow looked hostile that day." Israeli pilots, operating with patchy intelligence and minimal rest, flew sortie after sortie. By June 8th, many had been in the air almost continuously for 3 days. Combat fatigue was not just a risk, it was an ever-present enemy. Mistakes became more likely. Visual IDs became harder to trust. And in this fog of war, both literal and metaphorical, the USS Liberty steamed directly into harm's way. To many Israeli analysts, what they saw on their radar screens looked suspicious. A gray ship operating close to the war zone, broadcasting signals, seemingly shadowing Israeli movements. In that high-tension environment, it didn't take much for assumptions to harden into conclusions. Orders were issued, aircraft were scrambled, torpedo boats revved up and raced toward the unknown vessel. What followed would become one of the most controversial and tragic incidents of the 20th century. But that moment, 8 a.m. June 8th, was when the perfect storm began to form. Miscommunication, fear, fog, war, and a shared belief that every shadow on the water might be an enemy. The attack timeline, minute by minute. The events of June 8th, 1967, unfolded with the brutal precision of a nightmare in slow motion. As the USS Liberty continued its signals intelligence mission in what were assumed to be neutral waters, the day's deadly misidentification gained momentum. At exactly 13:41 local time, the first Israeli Mirage 3 fighters screamed low over the horizon. Without warning, they opened fire, strafing the Liberty's decks with 30-millimeter cannon fire and rockets. To the pilots, the ship below appeared to be a strange military vessel, gray-hulled, clearly bristling with electronic gear, and without any easily recognizable markings from their angle and altitude. Radio chatter between the pilots and their ground controllers later revealed confusion and urgency. Unmarked ship, unusual antennas, possibly hostile. On board the Liberty, chaos erupted. The crew, many of whom were unarmed intelligence analysts, scrambled for cover. Men were torn apart at their workstations. Communications gear erupted in flames, and the deck ran red with blood and jet fuel. As bullets stitched across the superstructure, the sailors did everything they could to signal their identity. A large American flag, nearly 13 feet long, had been hoisted earlier in the day, but in the heat of the attack it was shredded and burned away by gunfire. Realizing that visibility might be part of the problem, the crew raised an even larger holiday ensign, a massive American flag reserved for ceremonial occasions, and waved it frantically from the signal bridge. It fluttered violently in the prop wash of the attacking jets, but it was unclear whether the Israeli pilots ever saw it. The air assault lasted nearly 25 minutes. The ship's communication systems were among the first targets, deliberately knocked out to prevent distress signals. Only one working channel remained, and it took heroic improvisation by radio men to get a garbled SOS to the Sixth Fleet. On the bridge, Commander William McGonigal, already wounded by shrapnel, fought to keep the ship afloat and ordered damage control parties to battle fires in the engine room and below decks. Then, at 14:24, the situation grew even more dire. Fast-moving Israeli motor torpedo boats appeared on the horizon, closing rapidly. Through his binoculars, one of the Israeli commanders scanned the battered ship. He reported seeing no flag and no visible hull numbers, just a smoldering warship-shaped silhouette. In his report, he also cited what he believed to be incoming naval gunfire from the shoreline, a claim that was later proven false, the result of misinterpreted radar reflections or sheer panic. Believing the ship might return fire, he gave the order to engage. At 14:31, a torpedo was launched. It struck the Liberty on her starboard side, ripping open a massive hole below the waterline. The blast flooded the research compartments, killing dozens instantly and trapping others behind twisted bulkheads and rising seawater. The crew, already reeling from the airstrike, now faced catastrophic flooding and the possibility of the ship breaking in half. Among those killed were many of the intelligence staff working below decks, linguists, analysts, and cryptologists whose job had been to listen, not to fight. As the torpedo boat circled, Israeli forces finally established closer visual contact and reportedly spotted the American flag. Realizing the mistake, they ceased fire. One of the patrol boats signaled an offer to assist, but the Liberty, with dead and dying still strewn across her decks, rejected it. The damage was done. By the time the attack ended, the cost was horrifying. 34 American sailors were dead, and 171 others were wounded, many critically. The ship itself bore 821 holes from cannon shells and shrapnel. Flames still licked the topside compartments, and her communications gear was gutted, and yet, somehow, she stayed afloat. The incident was so unprecedented that even the U.S. Navy's top brass were divided in their response. The Israeli government quickly issued an apology, claiming it had mistaken the ship for an Egyptian freighter or coastal vessel. The U.S. initially accepted the explanation, but survivors and intelligence officials would raise questions for decades. Many believed the attack was not an accident, but rather a preemptive strike to prevent Liberty's powerful antennas from intercepting sensitive Israeli military operations on the Sinai front. The U.S. Navy declined Israel's offer of rescue assistance. Instead, damage control crews and survivors managed, against all odds, to stabilize the ship and steer it away from immediate danger. The Liberty, crippled but afloat, limped toward Malta with a skeleton crew, leaving a trail of smoke and unanswered questions in her wake. The Israeli investigation findings. In the years following the tragic attack on the USS Liberty, controversy and speculation swirled. Many in the United States, particularly among the intelligence community and Navy veterans, struggled to reconcile the severity of the incident with the Israeli claim that it was a case of mistaken identity. To address both domestic and international pressure, the Israeli government conducted multiple inquiries, the most comprehensive being the 1980 Knesset Review, which sought to analyze the events of June 8, 1967, with the benefit of hindsight and access to military records. According to the Knesset's findings, the attack was the result of a tragic convergence of errors and assumptions rather than a deliberate act of aggression. Central to the Israeli defense was the belief that the USS Liberty had been mistaken for the Egyptian freighter El Qusayr, a 1920s-era horse transport ship that had been converted for coastal use by the Egyptian Navy. Despite vast differences in actual structure and equipment, the review suggested that from a distance and under combat stress, the silhouette of the Liberty, low slung and bristling with antennas, could be confused with the outdated vessel. Communication failures also played a critical role. The Israeli Navy had not been informed that the Israeli Air Force had already engaged the ship nearly an hour earlier. This critical lapse meant that when Israeli torpedo boat commanders arrived on the scene, they believed they were encountering a fresh, hostile threat, not a ship that had just endured a devastating aerial attack. The Knesset report revealed that the United States' prior notification of the Liberty's presence, an essential diplomatic step to ensure friendly forces were identified and protected, arrived nearly 18 hours too late to be actionable. Israeli command centers never received this information, leaving local commanders to make life-or-death decisions without full situational awareness. Adding to the confusion was the general atmosphere of war. The Six-Day War was at its peak, with Israeli forces fighting on multiple fronts against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Just days earlier, Egyptian naval commandos had launched attacks along Israel's coastline, increasing paranoia among Israeli naval units. Every contact at sea was viewed through the lens of potential hostility. Compounding matters were the notorious quirks of Mediterranean radar operations during the summer months. False echoes and radar anomalies were common due to atmospheric distortions, a factor that misled Israeli radar operators into reporting enemy fire from the shoreline during the Liberty encounter, further escalating the tension. Perhaps the most poignant and controversial commentary came from former Israeli Air Force pilot Yiftah Spector, one of the men who flew the Mirage 3 during the initial attack. Speaking years later, Spector encapsulated the tragedy in a single sentence. "We saw what we expected to see, an enemy ship where no friendlies were supposed to be." His words laid bare the psychological fog that permeates warfare, where misidentification and assumption can prove just as lethal as enemy fire. Though the Knesset report sought to close the chapter with transparency, for many Americans, especially survivors of the USS Liberty, the explanations felt incomplete. The notion that the world's most advanced ally could mistake a clearly marked U.S. Navy intelligence ship in broad daylight after prolonged observation remained difficult to accept. And yet, from the Israeli perspective, it was a horrifying accident born of miscommunication, flawed intelligence, and the unforgiving chaos of a multi-front war. Enduring controversies, both sides. Decades after the June 8, 1967, attack on the USS Liberty, the incident remains one of the most controversial chapters in modern naval history. While multiple investigations and official statements have attempted to clarify what happened that day, key questions continue to divide historians, veterans, and policymakers, both in the United States and Israel. Supporters of the Israeli account point to several official documents and declassified materials that reinforce the theory of mistaken identity. Among the most cited is a series of National Security Agency (NSA) intercepts, released in 2003, which suggests that Israeli pilots were genuinely confused about the ship's nationality during the attack. These intercepts include cockpit audio of pilots and ground controllers expressing doubt and asking whether the vessel might be American. Additionally, the U.S. Naval Court of Inquiry, conducted shortly after the incident, concluded there was no evidence that the attack was made with knowledge that the ship was American. Although that conclusion was later criticized by many as rushed and incomplete, it remains the only official U.S. military finding on record. Further bolstering Israel's case are historical precedents. Friendly fire incidents, even among Allied forces, were tragically common in prior wars. During World War II and the Korean War, U.S. and British forces repeatedly struck their own units due to faulty intelligence or battlefield confusion. In the fog of war, even the most well-trained militaries have made deadly errors. Israeli officials argue that the Liberty tragedy must be viewed in this context, a misidentification in the midst of a fast-moving, high-stakes conflict. However, critics of the official narrative continue to raise profound and troubling questions, ones that have never been fully resolved. One of the most persistent is the issue of the life rafts. Survivors of the Liberty testified that after the torpedo hit, as sailors attempted to launch life rafts, Israeli forces strafed and destroyed them in the water. This action, seen by many as a violation of the rules of war, has never been adequately explained by the Israeli government. Another major point of contention concerns radio communication. Throughout the attack, the Liberty attempted to signal its American identity using multiple radio frequencies, signal flags, and even flashing light. Yet no formal radio challenge was issued by the Israeli forces before the torpedo boats opened fire. Critics ask, why wasn't there at least a demand for identification before launching such a deadly assault? Perhaps the most mysterious and haunting controversy of all is why the United States appeared to recall its own rescue aircraft. Eyewitness accounts and declassified documents indicate that U.S. 6th Fleet aircraft were launched toward the Liberty shortly after the attack began, but were ordered back before reaching the scene. Some allege that this was done to avoid escalating a diplomatic crisis with Israel. Others believe it was part of a broader cover-up. To this day, the decision remains shrouded in secrecy, fueling ongoing speculation among veterans and researchers. The Liberty incident endures not just because of the death toll or the damage to the ship, but because it represents a moment where trust between allies was profoundly shaken. For some, the explanations provided have been sufficient. For others, the unanswered questions still demand greater scrutiny. In the words of former Liberty survivor Joe Meters, "This wasn't just a tragedy, it was a betrayal, and until all the truth is known, the wound remains open." Human cost, the forgotten middle. Beyond the politics, inquiries, and unanswered questions, the attack on the USS Liberty left behind a human legacy often overlooked, a legacy marked by trauma, guilt, and an enduring search for closure on both sides of the tragedy. For the American crew members who survived that day, the physical injuries were only the beginning. Many returned home with deep psychological scars. Despite their harrowing ordeal, formal recognition from their own government was long delayed. For over 40 years, these sailors fought not just to process what happened, but to be seen, heard, and acknowledged. Dozens of survivors reported suffering from untreated post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, made worse by an official silence that, for decades, bordered on denial. In the absence of answers, they leaned on one another. Each year, survivors and their families continue to gather, not in protest, but in remembrance. These reunions are marked by a quiet dignity and a collective grief that never fully subsides. But while American pain is well documented, the Israeli side of this story carries its own weight of remorse, one rarely explored in public forums. Several Israeli pilots and naval personnel involved in the attack later admitted, in private interviews or memoirs, that they carried guilt long after the war ended. Some struggled with substance abuse in the years that followed. Others were unofficially sidelined or passed over for promotions, bearing the quiet burden of a mission that would never be spoken of openly. The attack, though framed officially as a tragic error, became a personal curse for some who participated. One of the most striking moments of reconciliation came years later when Liberty survivor James N.A., who authored one of the first books about the attack, privately met with retired Israeli officer Avraham Lunz, believed to have been involved in operational decisions that day. Their conversation was not about blame, but about humanity. Lunz, visibly emotional, reportedly told N, "If we'd known, we'd have sent flowers, not rockets." That simple sentence captures the deepest truth of the Liberty incident. At its core, it was a tragedy shared not only in death and destruction, but in the lifelong grief it imposed on the very people who carried out the orders and those who endured their consequences. It was not just a military mistake or a diplomatic flashpoint. It was a human catastrophe, one whose middle ground, the common pain between adversaries, has too often been forgotten. Why this matters to your audience. More than half a century later, the attack on the USS Liberty remains one of the most haunting and complex chapters of Cold War naval history, not just for what happened, but for what it reveals about the fragile intersection of war, politics, and human error. For modern viewers, especially veterans, historians, and those who lived through the turbulent 1960s, this story resonates on multiple levels. First, it is a stark reminder of the Cold War context in which it unfolded, a time when global tensions ran high and information was often incomplete, contradictory, or dangerously misunderstood. The Liberty incident shows how even the most advanced military forces can fall victim to breakdowns in communication and faulty assumptions. It was a tragedy born not only of missiles and torpedoes, but of invisible gaps between intelligence agencies, allies, and frontline units. In a world increasingly defined by electronic warfare and rapid response doctrine, the lessons remain chillingly relevant. Second, it speaks to military realism. In war, even allies can become accidental enemies. The fog of war is not just a metaphor. It's a lived reality for sailors, pilots, and commanders. The Liberty attack exemplifies how fast-moving conflicts like the Six-Day War can spiral out of control, leaving behind damage that diplomacy alone struggles to repair. It underscores how fragile identification protocols can be, especially when political urgency overrides caution. Third, and perhaps most compelling, is the human drama. The men aboard the Liberty were not combatants. They were intelligence gatherers, technicians, and young sailors performing a peacetime mission in international waters. Many were barely out of high school. That they were caught in such a violent storm, with no warning and no opportunity to defend themselves, makes this a story not of heroes and villains, but of ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstances. Your audience, particularly those who lived through the 1960s, will remember this time vividly. For Israel, 1967 was both its darkest and finest hour, a six-day struggle for survival that reshaped the Middle East. For the United States, the incident came during a moment of national exhaustion. President Lyndon B. Johnson was preoccupied with the quagmire of Vietnam, and the public was already growing weary of endless wars and government secrecy. Many will recall how muted the U.S. response to Liberty's distress was, and how it strained the early bonds of what would become one of America's closest alliances. But there may still be a path forward. In recent years, new gestures have emerged. In 2017, an Israeli ambassador expressed deep regret for the incident during a private memorial. In 2021, several U.S. Liberty veterans were formally awarded Purple Hearts, a long overdue recognition. And joint U.S.-Israeli historical research projects have been proposed, seeking to bring clarity and closure while the last survivors are still alive. As 90-year-old survivor Ernie Gallo once put it, "I don't need apologies, just the full truth before we're all gone." Suggested closing sequence: a split-screen image, American and Israeli veterans, aged and solemn, sitting in quiet reflection, fades slowly into a grainy 1967 photograph of the wounded Liberty, her hull scorched, her radar masts shattered, yet still flying a replacement American flag high above the chaos. A final image of the flag rippling in the Mediterranean breeze reminds us, the truth is not about blame, it's about remembrance.